Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Andrew Peach, and in the early hours of Sunday the 19th of August, these are our main stories. The former Secretary-General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, who's died, has been praised for his humanitarian work. Thousands of people have attended a state funeral in the Italian city of Genoa for many of those killed in the motorway bridge collapse. And Ecuador brings in tough rules to try to stop thousands of Venezuelans from entering the country without a passport. Also in this podcast,
my last season of track and field, that I wanted to play football, and I knew what I'm capable of, and as you all know, I love Australia, so I'm happy.
The world's greatest sprinter fires the starting gun on his football career, and the British couple who booked a taxi in France and ended up in the sea. First, current and former world leaders have spoken of their sadness at the death of Kofi Annan, who passed away in Switzerland at the age of 80 following a short illness. He rose through the ranks of the United Nations to become its first black African leader. Mr. Annan stood down as the 7th UN Secretary-General almost 12 years ago. He'd been elected in 1996 and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2001 for his humanitarian work. But his leadership wasn't without controversy. Naomi Grimley looks back at his life.
Kofi Annan was the son of a governor of Ghana's Ashanti province. He studied in America and Switzerland before joining the UN and working his way up through its ranks. He was widely liked by fellow diplomats for his softly spoken manner, but he was sometimes accused of being too passive. As head of UN peacekeeping in the mid-1990s, he was criticised for not doing more to stop the massacres in both the Bosnian Civil War and the Rwandan genocide. In his first term as UN Secretary-General, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for revitalising the organisation. His second term in office, however, was marred by the divisive row over the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Mr. Annan had hoped to persuade George W. Bush's administration to allow UN weapons inspectors more time to assess whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But he failed to stop the march to war, admitting to the BBC later that he thought the intervention had no justification.
I hope we do not see another Iraq-type operation for a long time.
It was illegal.
Yes, I've indicated it's not in conformity with the UN Charter. From our point of view and from the Charter point of view, it was illegal.
Mr. Annan's time in office was also dogged by an embarrassing scandal over the UN's Oil for Food programme. The multi-billion-dollar scheme had been set up to allow Iraq to buy food and medicines with the proceeds of regulated oil sales without breaking the sanctions imposed on the country. But the programme was mismanaged and engulfed in corruption. There were calls for Kofi Annan's resignation after he was personally criticised by an independent inquiry for failing to exert proper control over the troubled project. Looking back himself over his time in office, he described his greatest achievement as ushering in the Millennium Development Goals, which for the first time set global targets on issues such as poverty and child mortality. After his time at the UN was up, he established the Kofi Annan Foundation, which reflected his interest in the developing world and agricultural improvements to prevent hunger. Indeed, he joked that in his retirement, he'd become Farmer Kofi.
Well, perhaps will Kofi Annan be missed more than in his home country, Ghana. On the streets of the capital, Accra, people expressed their sorrow and pride.
I feel very sad. Anywhere in Africa or in the world, you mention Kofi Annan, they will mention Ghana. So I feel we have missed a great person.
I feel so very, very bad. I just heard the news. We are having him as a great leader. We are very proud of him because he has taken our name very far. Kofi Annan is a good man. Every Ghanaian has to be proud, and his memory will never wipe up. So I'm very, very, very sad.
The former US President Barack Obama said Mr. Annan never stopped his pursuit of a better world. President Putin of Russia praised his wisdom and courage, even in the most difficult situations. The current UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, said Mr. Annan was a guiding force for good. And the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said Mr Annan had championed the African cause at the UN.
We were filled with pride to see an African leader dealing with world problems and finding solutions for them. So we dip our heads to him in great memory of him, and we will remember him fondly. But he has left a legacy of peacemaking in the world.
My colleague Julian Marshall's been talking to Edward Mortimer, Kofi Annan's chief speechwriter and his director of communications at the UN, and he was asked about his former boss's softly spoken style of diplomacy.
I think it's true that he was very careful. He was the kind of person who perhaps often thought before he spoke, and he knew that in his job, shouting at people would not achieve any results. He was quite good at not saying yes, when he didn't want to. And on the whole, the quieter he went, the more you knew that he was not comfortable and that you were unlikely to get anything out of him.
I mean, I appreciate that it was before your time, but people often point to Kofi Annan's behaviour over Rwanda as being a considerable failing at the time that he was head of UN peacekeeping operations.
Well, again, I think it was a failure of the United Nations, and I would say particularly of its key member states, because when the genocide started and some Belgian peacekeepers were killed by the Hutu extremists, the other Western countries, Belgium included, who had peacekeepers there, withdrew them. And the Security Council went along with that. Kofi Annan was desperately, I think he rang about 80 different governments to try and get more troops, but nobody was willing to send them.
What did Kofi Annan himself think were his major achievements as UN Secretary General?
I would say that what he felt was important was to show that the UN was at the service not just of governments, but of the peoples of the world. He did a lot to lead the battle against HIV/AIDS, particularly getting the big pharmaceutical companies to agree to make antiretroviral drugs available in poor countries at affordable prices. And I think that he did a lot to make people more aware of the danger of genocide and ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanities, and the responsibility which doesn't stop at national frontiers.
Edward Mortimer with Julian Marshall. Now to Italy. A state funeral in the city of Genoa as the country commemorated dozens of people killed when a bridge collapsed on Tuesday. So far, 43 people have been confirmed dead. This was a public ceremony attended by the President and the Prime Minister. 18 of the families took part, but others chose not to, either citing the need to bid farewell in private or saying they blame the authorities for what happened. Leading the service, the Archbishop of Genoa, Angelo Bagnasco, talked about the suffering.
The collapse of the Morandi Bridge over the Polcevera River has created a gash in the heart of Genoa. The wound is deep. It is made above all by the endless pain for those who have lost their lives and for the missing, for their family members, the wounded and the many displaced.
The government has begun the process of removing the licence of the company whose job it was to maintain the bridge. The boss of Autostrada, Giovanni Castellucci, said he and his colleagues were suffering with the community. Our Europe regional editor Danny Aberhard told me the tragedy is still very raw.
If any reminder was needed, 4 bodies have been recovered from the rubble since Friday, and another person, a Romanian lorry driver, has died of his injuries. So it's still very, very fresh. It was very emotional scenes as a long line of coffins all covered in white flowers were lined up in the conference hall. Thousands of people attended there, including the local Genoese football teams, politicians. Big round of applause for the firefighters. So there are lots of questions still unanswered. A commission of inquiry inquiry is starting to look into that. One of the things they're looking at is the cable stays that held part of the bridge up and whether there was a failure there.
The other thing that's happened today is a news conference given by the company responsible for managing the bridge. What was said there?
Well, at the conference, at the news conference, there were the chairman and the CEO of Autostrada per l'Italia, the company. They've taken a very different line to how they responded to the initial disaster. They were expressing a lot of compassion for the victims. But the CEO, Giovanni Castellucci, was asked if he took responsibility for the disaster and whether he'd apologised, something that he declined to do.
I would say that apologies and responsibilities are things that, are interconnected. You apologize if you feel you are responsible for. And as I said before, I believe that the technical situation is so complex that it's up to justice to understand what happened and why and under which conditions.
Now, Mr. Castellucci has said that his company will do everything it can to help the authorities get to the bottom of what caused the disaster. He underlined that the company itself is confident that it did everything in terms of its monitoring obligations. He went on to say that it was committing money both to help the victims with the families of the victims with their immediate needs, but also to help Genoa and even to rebuild or build a new version of the bridge, possibly within 8 months.
Danny Eberhard with me. Every day, more than 4,000 Venezuelan migrants have been arriving at Ecuador's border with Colombia. Now, Ecuador has had enough and brought in new rules to stop Venezuelans from entering the country without a passport. Most of them only have identity cards, and these people are camping outside a border checkpoint.
I feel powerless because the truth is, I arrived here with the expectation of wanting to work and wanting to make a new life, and they closed the doors on us this way, by asking for passports and documents. It's very difficult for many of us because we don't have them.
That was truly a surprise. We found out today. It's very sad because there are many, many Venezuelans leaving, and with this measure they won't let them leave. I don't know what they'll do now.
We were on the road already when they put the news out, just like that. Boom. We left on Wednesday, and all of a sudden they told us on Saturday. Well, I think it was Saturday, as I'm still rather confused. We would at least like the Ecuadorian authorities to help us.
Venezuelans want to escape their country because of poverty and hyperinflation. America's editor Candice Piette says people in the region can normally cross borders without a passport.
They're allowed by regional international agreements to travel on ID cards. Now, this is very significant also because this is one of two countries that have done this. Peru is also doing the same thing. But in Ecuador, it risks creating this huge backup in the coming days of migrants who've crossed through Colombia, and they'll get stuck on that side, on the Colombian side of the border. The migrants are crossing Colombia, hitching all by foot, and then flowing through Ecuador, heading south to Peru and Chile, many to join relatives already there who've made the trip. And now there's this issue that they might just get stuck in this big, long, flowing journey of theirs.
There's also been violence against Venezuelan migrants in Brazil.
Yeah, it seems nobody wants the Venezuelan migrants at the moment. The flows are huge. More than 1 million have entered Colombia, for example, the first port of call, the first country in this big long chain. And in Brazil also, they've been coming in across a border in the kind of upper Amazon region of Brazil. And there we've seen some attacks today, attacks on Saturday in this very small border town. It started with a local businessman being robbed and beaten, and some of the Venezuelan migrants had to flee back across the border. And then there were also reports that they'd been attacking Brazilian cars who'd been shopping on the other side of the border there. So the problem really is that these flows of migrants are getting too huge. They bring with them diseases, desperation, crime, prostitution. Nobody wants them around anymore, and nobody's really thinking together in the region to deal with the problem. This is the biggest movement of people in Latin America in decades.
Candice Piette. Now, conventional wisdom has it that 32 years of age is a bit old to start a career as a professional footballer. But then Usain Bolt has spent much of his life defying conventional wisdom. The sprinter has arrived in Australia, where he's going to go on trial with the Central Coast Mariners. Jonathan Savage has more.
Hi Usain, how are you going?
From the Diamond League to the A-League. With 11 world titles and 8 Olympic gold medals, Usain Bolt is arguably the greatest sprinter of all time. He landed in Sydney on Saturday with a new goal, or rather new goals, in mind.
Welcome Usain, welcome.
We're used to seeing Usain Bolt in Jamaican black and gold, but instead of spandex on arrival in Australia, he wore a scarf in those same colours bearing the name of the Central Coast Mariners football team. On Tuesday, Bolt's 32nd birthday, what's being called an indefinite training period gets underway. The aim is to turn the sprinter into a striker.
Watch out, I'm on the way. Remember, I don't think limits.
That was Usain Bolt speaking in a video released by the Mariners. They finished bottom of the league last year, so from their point of view, they've really got nothing to lose, and the publicity can't hurt. Being quick is a useful weapon on the football pitch, but it's no guarantee of success. Bolt, though, as ever, doesn't lack confidence.
I've said it since of my last season of track and field that I wanted to play football, and I knew what I'm capable of. I know what I can do, so I'm happy for the Mariners, so giving me the opportunity to show what I'm capable of. And as you all know, I love Australia, so I'm happy.
This isn't Usain Bolt's first foray onto a football field. He's previously trained with Germany's Borussia Dortmund, Mamelodi Sundowns of South Africa and Strømsgodset of Norway. Now he's in Australia. The A-League season begins in late October, so they'll have to work fast. Fortunately, fast is what Usain Bolt does best.
Jonathan Savage reporting. Still to come in this podcast.
The level of water has risen tremendously. It has been raining heavily since yesterday. It is not slowing down, and that is why people are scared.
We'll hear from the southern Indian state of Kerala, where there's no sign of floodwaters receding. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has called on Europe to do everything it can to help with Syria's economic recovery or face a huge refugee burden. He was speaking in Germany before 3 hours of talks with the Chancellor Angela Merkel. Earlier, he attended the wedding of the Foreign Minister of Austria at a vineyard in the south of the country. Karin Kneissl, who was picked for the job by the far-right Freedom Party, has been criticised for inviting him. Our correspondent Jenny Hill reports from Berlin.
Angela Merkel swept down the grand staircase outside the 18th century Schloss Meseberg to greet the man who holds such influence over so many global conflicts. Vladimir Putin is said to have a grudging respect for the German Chancellor, but their relationship is tense. And speaking just before talks got underway, she made it clear that she has some big demands.
Ein wichtiges Thema heute wird das Thema Syrien sein.
Syria, she said, would be an important topic. She wanted to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe in and around Idlib. Fighting may have decreased elsewhere, she said, but that doesn't mean peace has been achieved. Mrs. Merkel's mood may not have been improved by the fact that Mr. Putin had kept her waiting. He'd been dancing at a wedding in Austria all afternoon. The president was the special guest of the bride, who's also the country's foreign minister. Karin Kneissl looked delighted as she danced arm in arm with Mr. Putin. After all, he brought her a huge bouquet of flowers and reportedly a Cossack choir. But her critics say the invitation undermined EU policy towards Russia. Speaking later in Berlin, Mr. Putin was keen to remind the EU that it needs him.
Кстати, в июне исполнилось 50 лет.
For more than 50 years, he said, Russia's reliably provided an uninterrupted energy supply to Western Europe. Russia's made and is making a significant contribution to the energy security of the entire European continent. Even Angela Merkel admitted she didn't expect much from the talks, but she insisted it's vital to keep talking to Russia. She and Mr. Putin don't agree on much, but these are times of shifting alliances, and in the age of Donald Trump, they may find common ground.
Now, rescue teams in helicopters and boats have braved torrential rain to reach people stranded in floodwaters in the southern Indian state of Kerala. Nearly 200 people have been killed in recent days, many in landslides. After visiting Kerala, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi described the situation as devastating. Shaukat Ali lives in Alappuzha and says there's no sign of the downpours easing.
The level of water has risen tremendously. It has been raining heavily since yesterday. It is not slowing down, and that is why people are scared. They're scared that the water will enter their homes again.
Schools and community centres have been converted into relief camps for the rescued, but Kerala is struggling to cope with unusually heavy monsoon rains. Speaking in New Delhi, Parvinder Singh from the Red Cross said it was a desperate crisis.
The situation really is grim. What we are hearing is that the rains will continue, and Kerala is for just 580 kilometers of land space, which has 44 rivers, and all the rivers are overflowing. So it's going to be a long way to recovery as well, because the infrastructure has been wiped out, the airport is underwater, the electricity is currently being cut off.
My colleague Saman Ravi from BBC Hindi is in Trishul, one of the worst affected areas.
The Periyar River is increasing by the minute, and this is a cause of concern for everybody. And that is the reason that people were being shifted to safer places. They left with the little belongings that they have, their clothes and some essential things, and they have abandoned their homes and they have fled for safety to higher areas. But still, people are very apprehensive. They are fearing that the rains, when they lash again, they are going to bring more devastation, because most of the roads have been washed away, bridges have collapsed, a railway network has collapsed, and this is in a state of complete paralysis because the petrol pumps are shut. Tankers carrying diesel and petrol, they are not being able to reach all these places. And even in some places, people are stuck and they are yet to be actually rescued from there. And those are the areas which are very difficult areas. Kerala is known as God's own country because of its greenery and the backwaters. So now the backwaters have flown and swelled. Many dams which were there on different rivers, they had to be opened. Otherwise, the devastation could have been even more.
So a lot of people very worried about the fact that more heavy rain is forecast. What are conditions like for those who have fled and who are living on higher ground? In what kind of circumstances?
Some of them have shifted to their relatives who are living in other places in safer areas. Some of them are being rehabilitated by local people here in the Trishur, where I am currently now. They are providing them food and shelter in makeshift camps. So altogether, there are more than 3,000 camps functioning in different areas, some of them being run by the government and some of them being run by local people with local initiative, local volunteers. More than 300,000 people, they have been actually been uprooted from their place from where they live. More than 200,000, they have been abandoned by the sudden floods that have come.
Saman Ravi from BBC Hindi with me from Kerala. The annual Islamic pilgrimage, the Hajj, begins on Sunday. Some 2 million Muslims are expected to take part in 5 days of rituals in and around Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Our Arab Affairs editor is Sebastian Usher.
The central significance of Hajj to the almost 2 billion Muslims around the world may be unchanging, as are its rituals, but the way it's organised by Saudi Arabia continues to evolve. Hosting the pilgrimage is a matter of immense prestige and pride for Saudi Arabia and its royal family. But it's a huge logistical challenge, which has seen regular disasters occur, from deadly stampedes to fires. The Saudis have expanded and modernised the infrastructure around the Hajj at great expense. This year, they're stressing how it's becoming an increasingly high-tech operation with apps for translation and medical help. One innovation is a so-called nap pad from Japan, where pilgrims can take a breather from the intensity of the experience. Such modernisation is a key gambit of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. His Vision 2030 plan for Saudi Arabia is meant to allow the number of pilgrims to double in the next decade. In a sign of changing times, this year, for the first time, pilgrims will see Saudi women driving in the city streets. But the Crown Prince's reforms have been double-edged, with dissent both from religious hardliners and liberal reformists being harshly repressed.
Finally, to the British couple who booked an Uber taxi in Cannes in southern France and then had to swim to safety after their driver ended up in the sea by mistake. Taking up the story for us, Richard Hamilton.
Nick Christoforou and Sophia Toon were on a work trip in the south of France when their cab picked them up in the early hours of the morning. The driver was following a GPS app on his phone, but accidentally drove off the end of a jetty at a marina, Port Pierre Canto, in Cannes. 1 minute I was in the back of an Uber heading home, Mr. Christoforou said, and the next I was in the sea. Luckily, he managed to wind down one of the windows and escape. He then succeeded in pulling the others out. Had it not been for his quick thinking, he added, we would all be 100% dead. Photos showed their Citroën submerged in 3 metres of water. Despite their ordeal, they were still charged the $23 fare for their journey, although it's since been refunded. Uber said it checked that everyone was okay and offered them counselling. The driver, who was breathalyzed and found to be sober, has now been taken off their books.
Richard Hamilton reporting, and that's all from us for now. There will be an updated version of Global News available to download later. If you'd like to comment on this edition or the stories we included, do drop us an email. We enjoy hearing from you. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. My name's Andrew Peach. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.